Okay, I'm talking to Miro Griffiths, and he'll introduce himself and tell you all about himself. Miro, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Richard, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So my name's Miro Griffiths. I'm based in Liverpool, and I probably come at this topic from multiple different angles, really. Firstly, I come at this as a disabled person who has spent many years engaged in campaigning and activism and developing a political consciousness around the subject of disability and understanding my identity as a disabled person through a political lens. I also come at this from an academic point of view. So I'm a scholar in disability studies at the University of Leeds, and I'm also the co-director of the Centre for Disability Studies as well. And finally, I also come at this from an angle of engaging in policy making processes. So a lot of my research and also my experience of trying to influence social organization around disabled people's lives has been focused on policy making processes and legislative frameworks. If I think about my kind of trajectory through all those spaces, what's been quite important, I think, is to be guided by the voice of politics. And often when I was growing up, I very rarely thought about my identity as a political subject and recognize that political consciousness that surrounds trying to make sense of what disability is, how it is to be described, and how it is to be experienced. And also, most importantly, I suppose, is how to resist the experiences of disablement in everyday life. And that's extremely important because as you begin to make sense of your place in society, it is very easy to be dominated by that individual and medicalized narrative of assuming that you are the problem and that there is a desirability to conform to expectations, to normative practices, normative ideas of how you should exist and live your life and be within the communities that you belong to. Through my disability politics activism, I became aware that that narrative could be resisted, and it had to be resisted. It is essential to resist that narrative, because then what you find is that you start to orientate your understanding of disability not to be trapped within yourself, but to think about it in the way in which it is produced through social organization. So as I became involved in campaigning, and I did start often, much of my early experiences of what I thought campaigning was rooted in charity models and charity organizations that we would associate with being traditional disability organizations that do not represent the voices of disabled people or their interests. So what I thought campaigning was much aligned with that. And it was only when I became exposed to the ideas of what I call now radical and incremental activists. And what by that I mean radical activists who are producing visions for alternative ways of organizing society, of producing accessibility and inclusivity that require a radical overhaul of the way society is organized, that require deep-rooted organizational change within politics, within economics, within social and cultural. I was also exposed to what I refer to in my writing and my research as incremental activism, which is associated with trying to negotiate spaces of opportunity within the existing configurations of society. And having that exposure to both allowed me to, first and foremost, recognize that an alternative is possible. You don't have to go on living that you are to blame yourself, to assume that your identity is undesirable as a disabled person, and to recognize that the barriers that you experience are the fault of you, and therefore you are responsible for that. So resisting that allowed me then to think about, well, if I'm not to blame, then where is the blame? Where is the emphasis of responsibility in how disablement is being produced and sustained in society? And that's what led me to a social model interpretation of disability, and allowed me then to move away from these organizations and become much more focused on thinking about the role and the significance of disabled people's organizations. And by that, I think, all of us in our audiences who are familiar with disability politics will know that that means organizations that are run and controlled and managed by disabled people. But so becoming more orientated with these organizations allowed me to recognize that my focus of resistance should be entrenched within political arrangements, economic arrangements, social, cultural, technological arrangements, and so on. This is where the focus of resistance should be placed. And then this allows us then to think about the alternative. What does it mean to produce accessible and inclusive societies? So allowing my voice to kind of flourish within those spaces was essential, not just to my own political consciousness, but also to the spaces that I wanted to belong to as well. I was supported by many activists, including yourself, Richard, to have a voice and to think about how my ideas, my articulations of what I wanted from society, what I wanted from my participation within the communities that I wanted to belong to, how they were important to not just myself, but important to the demands and agendas and strategies that we were trying to create and produce within our disability activism. And I think this brings me to a key point, really, which I want to make here in this talk, which is to recognize the importance of capturing young people's perspective within disability activism. It's not to think about how to establish a youth voice in inverted commas. It's more about thinking, how do the ideas and imaginings and creativities and the experimentations that young disabled people want to have and want to pursue within disability activism, how that can affect the things that we are doing as part of our main agendas or part of our main strategies. Often we trap young disabled people's voices in just being a youth perspective. And I think that does a disservice really to what we are trying to achieve within disability activism, which is to think about how all of our ideas within the process of resistance and within the process of articulating an alternative vision for inclusive societies, how that can flourish because of the collaboration and ideas that come from different communities, whether that's youth groups, whether that's people from ethnic communities, whether that's those who are bringing in the intersections of sexuality and disability. It's about allowing all voices to flourish and how all voices can influence the opportunities to produce and realize accessible and inclusive societies.